All right, among world leaders reacting to the pontiff's death is King Charles, who is saying the Pope will be remembered for touching the lives of so many.
The passing of Pope Francis in April 2025 marked the end of a historic papacy. Known globally for his humility, progressive approach to leadership, and commitment to social justice, his influence extended far beyond the Catholic Church. But just before his death, Pope Francis shared something that sparked quiet conversation across Europe. Words directed not to fellow clergy or world leaders, but to Britain's King Charles III and Queen Camilla. While the Vatican has always maintained a formal and distant relationship with the British monarchy, largely due to centuries-old religious differences, Pope Francis was known for building bridges. Over the years, he developed a respectful rapport with King Charles, even before he ascended the throne. Their relationship wasn't just political or ceremonial. According to several reports, it was deeply personal. The Pope saw in Charles a leader facing the burdens of expectation and history. He also saw something quietly remarkable in Camilla, whose journey into the heart of royal life has been one of the most unexpected transformations in modern monarchy. In the days leading up to the Pope's death, King Charles and Queen Camilla paid what was initially described as a private, low-key visit to the Vatican. It was April 9, 2025, coinciding with their 20th wedding anniversary. The visit itself wasn't widely covered at the time, and for good reason. Pope Francis, having recently been discharged from hospital following a respiratory infection, was already visibly weakened. Many had assumed his schedule was too limited for such visits. But this meeting went ahead, behind closed doors, and it has since taken on new meaning. Those close to the Pope have hinted that during this quiet conversation, he expressed his deep admiration for Queen Camilla's strength and her evolving role in the monarchy. He reportedly praised her for showing what he called a quiet resilience, and for standing by Charles during one of the most complex transitions in royal history. For years, Camilla was viewed through the lens of controversy, often unfairly cast in the shadow of Princess Diana's legacy. But over time, her image changed, thanks in part to her steady presence and her commitment to royal duties. Pope Francis was said to be aware of her journey, and according to Vatican aides, he respected how she carried herself, especially in the face of intense scrutiny. King Charles, for his part, has long shared an interest in interfaith dialogue, environmental protection, and global peace, values that aligned with much of the Pope's own mission. Their shared commitment to the planet was a frequent topic in their previous meetings, most notably during climate summits and Commonwealth forums. But this final encounter in April was different. It was reflective, intimate, and, as some have put it, almost confessional in tone. While the contents of their discussion remain private, several reliable sources, both from inside the palace and the Vatican, have indicated that Pope Francis offered words of encouragement that felt unusually personal. To Charles, he expressed a sentiment that went beyond diplomacy. He acknowledged the emotional toll of kingship, especially in a time of health struggles, public criticism, and shifting political landscapes. The Pope knew Charles had been diagnosed with cancer just months before, and he knew the weight of the crown didn't just rest on tradition. It rested on the fragile shoulders of a man still navigating grief, illness, and generational expectation. In that moment, the Pope is said to have reminded Charles that his reign was not simply about maintaining the monarchy, but about embodying a kind of moral leadership, a leadership grounded in service rather than status. Those familiar with Pope Francis's tone and philosophy will recognize that message. He often spoke of humility as the highest form of strength. He admired those who led without needing to be seen. According to insiders, the Pope offered a prayer for both Charles and Camilla, not just for their health, but for their unity. He recognized Camilla's evolving role as not merely ceremonial, but supportive in the truest sense of the word. At 77, she has become one of the monarchy's most unexpected symbols of steadiness. Despite early public resistance, Camilla has steadily embraced her responsibilities as queen consort, attending engagements, supporting literacy campaigns, and maintaining a sense of continuity during a period of considerable uncertainty for the royal family. In his final days, Pope Francis chose not to issue sweeping political statements or global decrees. Instead, he turned his attention to individuals. His farewell to the royal couple was quiet, gentle, and layered with meaning. It's unclear whether he sensed that this meeting would be his last with them, but the tone of his message, both spiritual and fatherly, suggests he did. Some have speculated that his remarks carried a subtle nudge, perhaps even a message about transition. Could he have been suggesting that Camilla's role may grow even further? Could he have been encouraging Charles to focus less on duty and more on well-being? These are interpretations, not confirmed facts, but they echo the kinds of themes Pope Francis often returned to: health, compassion, personal calling, and moral legacy. And then, just 12 days later, the Pope passed away. His death left a vacuum in spiritual leadership that will be hard to fill. Yet it also magnified the meaning of his final encounters. For King Charles and Queen Camilla, the meeting may well have been more than ceremonial. It was a moment of reflection between two leaders in the twilight of their public lives, both having endured criticism, reinvention, and loss. In the immediate aftermath of the Pope's passing, King Charles issued a statement expressing profound sadness and praising the Pope's courage, empathy, and global influence. What stood out in the King's tribute was his personal tone. He called the Pope a man of deep faith and deep kindness, and noted the significance of their final meeting. It wasn't just about diplomatic ties, it was about shared humanity. This is why the Pope's final words to them, though still wrapped in mystery, continue to resonate. For those who followed the royal family closely, this moment offers a rare window into how figures like Pope Francis viewed their place in the modern world, less as symbols of power and more as bearers of responsibility. It's not about who sits on the throne, but how they carry the weight of it. In the months leading up to Pope Francis's final meeting with King Charles and Queen Camilla, both the monarchy and the Vatican had been navigating a period of personal and public transformation. Charles had recently announced that he was undergoing treatment for cancer, a disclosure that, while carefully managed, brought an unexpected vulnerability to his role as sovereign. At the same time, Queen Camilla was taking on more visible duties than ever before, representing the monarchy at major events and quietly reinforcing a sense of continuity during the king's recovery. Although the details of Charles's condition were kept deliberately vague, typical of royal protocol, the admission itself was striking. It marked one of the rare times a British monarch had publicly acknowledged serious health issues while still on the throne. Historically, the monarchy has often kept such matters private, even secret. But this time, the palace chose transparency, at least to a degree. Charles, only recently crowned after decades as the Prince of Wales, had stepped into the spotlight as king with a renewed sense of purpose. Yet his early reign was now being shaped not by policy or ceremony, but by a deeply human challenge: illness. This context matters, especially when considering the significance of Pope Francis's final words to the king. Like Charles, the Pope was also experiencing declining health. Both men, born within 6 months of each other in 1948, had spent their lives in service to institutions larger than themselves. Both had seen their public roles evolve in ways they could never have fully predicted. And both now faced the challenge of leading while physically vulnerable. For King Charles, the responsibility of monarch was always going to be complex. His long wait for the throne, often dubbed the longest apprenticeship in history, meant that when he finally did become king, expectations were sky high. Many hoped he would modernize the monarchy, streamline its functions, and bring a renewed relevance to the institution in an increasingly diverse Britain. Others saw him as a transitional figure, a bridge between the legacy of Queen Elizabeth II and the future reign of Prince William. But illness, as it often does, changed the tempo. The king, now in his late 70s, had to recalibrate what leadership looked like under these new constraints. He began reducing his public appearances. Many official duties were delegated. And stepping into that newly visible space was Queen Camilla. Camilla's rise within the royal family has never followed a traditional path. Her early relationship with Charles was steeped in controversy, particularly during the 1990s when she was widely perceived as the other woman in the breakdown of Charles and Diana's marriage. For years, public opinion was overwhelmingly negative. Even after their eventual marriage in 2005, it took time for Camilla to be accepted by much of the British public. But something shifted in recent years. Slowly and steadily, Camilla redefined herself, not through grand gestures, but through consistency. She took on patronages, often choosing causes that didn't always make headlines: domestic violence awareness, literacy, animal welfare. She avoided the spotlight where she could, choosing instead to build a reputation based on reliability and warmth during engagements. By the time she officially became Queen Consort in 2022, she had already laid the groundwork for broader public support. That support grew as her responsibilities increased, particularly after Charles's diagnosis. She began representing the crown more frequently at public events, church services, and official ceremonies. Her tone was always measured, her approach pragmatic. The result was a growing perception of Camilla as a stabilizing force, a figure the public could trust to quietly hold things together while the king focused on his health. This duality, Charles dealing with personal health challenges behind the scenes while Camilla became more front-facing, did not go unnoticed by observers of the monarchy, nor, apparently, by Pope Francis. Those who were present at their April meeting noted that the Pope spoke with particular warmth about Camilla's evolving role. He reportedly admired her service without spectacle, a phrase that closely reflects his own values around leadership and humility. It is not known whether the Pope made any direct reference to succession, abdication, or shifts within the monarchy, and it's unlikely such conversations would ever be confirmed. However, the timing of the meeting and the tone of his comments have led to speculation that he was expressing a quiet endorsement of how the couple was navigating this challenging chapter. For King Charles, receiving such affirmation from a global spiritual leader, one who understood the burdens of leadership better than most, would not have been taken lightly. Their shared values, especially around the environment, have been a consistent theme in their past meetings. Charles has long championed climate issues, organic farming, and sustainability, decades before these became mainstream concerns. Pope Francis, likewise, has been outspoken on the moral imperative to care for the planet, most notably through his 2015 encyclical Laudato Si. Their alignment on these issues forged a unique connection between Buckingham Palace and the Vatican, one rooted not just in diplomacy, but in principle. It's likely that their final conversation included reflections on this shared mission, one they both knew might soon be passed on to others. The Queen, for her part, has never been positioned as a monarch in waiting. Under British constitutional norms, the monarchy passes by bloodline, not by marriage. But in times of difficulty, history has shown that spouses often become central to royal continuity. Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, was instrumental during World War II. Prince Philip modernized the monarchy in subtle ways throughout Elizabeth II's reign. Camilla now finds herself in a similar position, supporting, adapting, and in some cases, leading quietly. What makes this moment so significant is not just the visibility of Camilla's role, but the growing public acceptance of it. While polls still vary in terms of popularity rankings, the Queen has undeniably gained a level of respect that once seemed out of reach. This change reflects a broader societal shift, one in which redemption arcs, second chances, and earned trust matter more than lineage or legacy alone. Within this context, Pope Francis's final meeting with the King and Queen takes on added weight. It was not just a farewell between two leaders. It was an acknowledgement of the roles they had grown into, the burdens they carried, and perhaps even a shared understanding of what true leadership looks like in the modern world. Not power, but presence. Not command, but care. On April 9, 2025, just 12 days before his passing, Pope Francis held what would become one of the final significant private audiences of his life. The guests were not world leaders in the political sense, but leaders in their own right, King Charles III and Queen Camilla. The royal couple had traveled to Rome on what was originally understood to be a state visit, scheduled to coincide with their 20th wedding anniversary. However, what actually took place inside the walls of the Vatican was something far more personal, intimate, and reflective. Their visit came at a time when all three individuals were facing serious personal challenges. Pope Francis had been recovering from repeated hospitalizations, including surgery and treatment for ongoing respiratory issues. His declining health had been a matter of concern among Vatican officials for months. At the same time, King Charles had recently announced to the public that he was undergoing treatment for cancer, and while the palace did not disclose specific details, His reduced public appearances and visibly thinner frame did not go unnoticed. As for Queen Camilla, she had quietly stepped into a more active role, supporting her husband both privately and in his royal duties. According to sources close to the Vatican, the meeting between the three was intentionally kept small and private. It took place at Casa Santa Marta, the Pope's residence within Vatican City, rather than in the more formal Apostolic Palace. The choice of location alone suggested this wasn't a typical diplomatic encounter. Casa Santa Marta is where Pope Francis had lived since the start of his papacy, eschewing the traditional papal apartments in favor of simpler surroundings. It reflected his preference for modesty and genuine interaction, and it offered a setting where conversations could unfold without cameras, protocols, or formalities. Reports from those briefed on the meeting suggest that the conversation covered much more than matters of ceremony or diplomacy. While it is normal for heads of state and religious leaders to exchange pleasantries and reaffirm shared values during such visits, this audience was marked by a noticeably different tone. Several aides described the atmosphere as warm, contemplative, and emotionally charged. At one point, the Pope is believed to have spoken candidly about the toll that leadership can take on the individual, not just physically, but spiritually. He reportedly acknowledged the pressure Charles had been under since ascending to the throne, and the fact that the early days of his reign were marked not by celebration, but by illness, global instability, and the shadow of an enormous legacy left by Queen Elizabeth II. The Pope, who had himself led the Church through a period of unprecedented change and global crisis, understood those challenges better than most. What makes this moment so remarkable is not just what was said, but who it came from. Pope Francis had long been seen as a figure who led with compassion rather than control. His decision to embrace humility as a strength rather than a weakness was something that deeply resonated with many global leaders, Charles included. Unlike some monarchs before him, Charles had never seemed entirely comfortable with public adoration or absolute authority. Instead, he had built his reputation on a different kind of leadership, one grounded in advocacy for the environment, interfaith dialogue, and the preservation of heritage and tradition. In many ways, these values aligned closely with those of Pope Francis. For Queen Camilla, the meeting held a different kind of resonance. Her journey into the heart of public life had not been smooth, and it had taken years for her to be fully accepted as a senior royal figure. Her quiet demeanor and preference for working behind the scenes had not gone unnoticed by the Pope. He reportedly praised her calm strength, a quality he greatly admired and had often spoken about in his own reflections on leadership. He saw in her a kind of steadiness that he believed was vital to any institution, whether it be the Church or the monarchy. There is no confirmed transcript of their conversation, and it is unlikely there ever will be. But those familiar with the Pope's style say his remarks often carried layered meaning. He was known to speak in phrases that sounded casual at first, but later revealed themselves to be deliberate and deeply thoughtful. Some who have analyzed the encounter believe he may have been offering more than just encouragement. He may have been gently preparing Charles and Camilla for the possibility of transition, whether that meant passing more duties to Prince William or simply shifting their roles in light of ongoing health challenges. Such speculation has not been confirmed by the royal household, but the timing of the visit and the Pope's known affinity for legacy planning have fueled these interpretations. It would not be out of character for him to speak with foresight, especially when addressing leaders nearing the later stages of their public service. After the private meeting, there were no public statements made by the Pope or the royal couple. The only confirmation that the audience had occurred came from a brief Vatican press note, which referred to it as a personal conversation and did not elaborate further. Buckingham Palace released a similarly minimal acknowledgement, thanking the Pope for his warm hospitality. Yet in the days that followed, the nature of that encounter began to take on more significance. When Pope Francis passed away on April 21, 2025, King Charles was among the first to issue a heartfelt tribute. His words struck a notably personal tone, referring to their recent meeting and describing the Pope as a man of great humility, insight, and unwavering moral strength. It was clear from his statement that the visit had affected him deeply. Some commentators pointed out that the king's statement focused less on global affairs and more on personal connection, suggesting that this final meeting had not just been a political obligation, but a moment of genuine spiritual reflection. In a time when the British monarchy is under continued scrutiny, moments like this offer a glimpse into the human side of royal life, one that exists behind the headlines and public events. Queen Camilla did not issue her own separate statement, but sources close to her say she found the meeting with the Pope both comforting and validating. For someone who had spent much of her life misunderstood or misjudged by the media, the recognition from one of the world's most influential religious figures carried emotional weight. This encounter has also prompted a wider conversation among historians and observers of royal tradition. What does it mean when two aging leaders meet in private, knowing that their time in the public eye may be limited? What messages are shared in these final conversations? And how might those messages influence the future of the institutions they represent? While the details remain confidential, the significance of the meeting is already evident in the way both institutions, the Vatican and the monarchy, have chosen to reflect on it. There has been a notable shift in tone. The emphasis is no longer just on duty, but on legacy, on compassion, on what it means to serve not just with formality, but with heart. In the absence of the king's frequent presence, Queen Camilla began to take on an increasingly active role. While her engagements had previously focused on literacy advocacy, support for victims of domestic abuse, and championing animals and rural life, she was now representing the crown in a broader range of capacities. From state visits to national commemorations, Camilla became the face of stability, a figure that, not too long ago, had been considered controversial by much of the public. Her expanded role was not the result of a formal announcement. It happened gradually and, to some extent, quietly. Royal observers noted that she had become more confident in her public speaking, more relaxed during walkabouts, and more at ease when interacting with guests at formal events. Those who met her at engagements described her as warm, informal, and surprisingly down-to-earth, far from the caricature once portrayed in tabloid headlines. This steady presence began to reshape public opinion. Polls conducted during this period showed a notable uptick in support for Queen Camilla, particularly among older generations who valued continuity and tradition. While younger audiences remained more ambivalent, many acknowledged her visible commitment to the monarchy and the way she had stepped into her role with what appeared to be genuine dedication. Behind closed doors, the royal household had entered what some aides described as a period of careful transition. While there was no suggestion that King Charles would abdicate or formally transfer powers, the ongoing nature of his illness meant that operational responsibilities had to be redistributed. Prince William took on more ceremonial duties, particularly those that involved direct public engagement. Meanwhile, Camilla's role expanded not only in public visibility but also in the day-to-day functioning of the royal household. This situation was not without precedent. In the final years of Queen Elizabeth II's reign, Prince Charles, as he was then, had increasingly stepped in for his mother, particularly during overseas engagements and state events. The monarchy had quietly developed systems of continuity, allowing the institution to function even when its central figure was unable to participate. Now, those same systems were being tested again, but in a different way. This time with a queen consort stepping forward during a king's illness. Camilla's visibility, however, came with renewed scrutiny. Some commentators questioned whether the increased reliance on her was a temporary solution or the beginning of a more lasting shift. There were discussions in the press about what it would mean if Camilla continued to take on central responsibilities, especially if King Charles's health failed to improve. While the monarchy remains governed by constitutional law, where only the sovereign wields executive authority, the reality of day-to-day public engagement often requires a visible, relatable presence. In that respect, Camilla was increasingly being viewed as a key figure in maintaining public confidence in the monarchy. Her position was also bolstered by how she handled the increased attention. She rarely gave interviews, avoided controversy, and kept her focus firmly on charitable work. When asked about her role in a rare comment during a royal engagement, she replied simply that she was doing what was needed. That kind of understated language, coupled with her consistent presence, helped shape a public image of her as dependable and practical. qualities many people look for in leadership, especially during uncertain times. At the same time, King Charles's quieter role created space for reflection about his future as monarch. While there was no official talk of abdication, questions lingered. Would his treatment allow him to resume full royal duties? Was a long-term plan being quietly developed behind palace walls? Would Prince William eventually be asked to assume a more formal leadership role sooner than expected? These were the kinds of questions being raised more frequently, both by the public and by royal commentators. The royal household remained characteristically silent on the matter. Buckingham Palace continued to issue occasional updates, emphasizing the king's good spirits and ongoing commitment to his constitutional role. But it was clear to anyone watching closely that things had shifted. The dynamic was no longer the same as it had been in the months immediately following his coronation. Some royal watchers believe this moment of uncertainty may ultimately define the beginning of Charles's reign more than his coronation ever could. For a monarch who had waited decades to take the throne, he now found himself dealing not with celebration but with challenge. Illness had a way of disrupting even the best-laid plans, and the king's approach, more private than his mother's but no less serious, reflected his deeply personal way of coping with it. Those who know Charles well say he has always been a reflective man. He has long been interested in philosophy, theology, and the environment, subjects that require patience, perspective, and a willingness to embrace nuance. That temperament, while sometimes criticized as indecisive during his time as Prince of Wales, may now serve him well as he navigates this chapter of his reign. He is not rushing into decisions, nor is he seeking the spotlight. Instead, he appears to be leaning into a quieter form of leadership, one that mirrors the values Pope Francis spoke of in his final meeting with the king. The Pope had admired those who led with humility. He often spoke about the difference between authority and service, between image and impact. For Charles and Camilla, those values now seemed more relevant than ever. Their actions in recent months, marked by steadiness rather than spectacle, reflected a shared commitment to duty in its most human form. What made their meeting so significant wasn't necessarily any single thing that was said. It was the moment itself, the convergence of three public figures, each nearing the later stages of their public lives, each navigating the emotional and physical challenges that come with age, responsibility, and visibility. And in that moment, Pope Francis, who had long emphasized the importance of personal character over public image, chose to spend some of his final energy offering quiet words of reflection to King Charles and Queen Camilla. The symbolism of it all was not lost on those familiar with the deeper language of leadership. When two figures like Charles and the Pope come together, it's not about transactional politics or public appearances. It becomes something more reflective, a space to acknowledge burdens, revisit purpose, and possibly share guidance that goes beyond ceremony. Since the visit, some have speculated that Pope Francis's final conversation with Charles included a kind of spiritual endorsement, perhaps even encouragement for the king to consider the longer arc of his legacy. The idea is not without precedent. The Pope had in his later years spoken openly about transitions, about preparing others to take the mantle, and about knowing when to step back. He himself had considered resignation due to ill health, though he ultimately remained in office until his death. If anyone understood the toll of prolonged public service, it was him. Still, there's been no indication that King Charles intends to step down. The monarchy does not operate on the same principles as the papacy, and abdications in British history are rare and fraught with complication. Yet the questions persist, not out of scandal or controversy, but out of a genuine sense that the royal family is entering a new phase. And Pope Francis's final meeting with the king may have gently highlighted that reality. One of the reasons the encounter has had such lasting weight is the way it underscored the quiet evolution of Queen Camilla's role. Just a decade ago, it would have been nearly unthinkable for Camilla to be at the center of a discussion about the future of the monarchy. For many years, her name was synonymous with royal scandal, and public sentiment was slow to soften. But time has a way of recontextualizing things, and her transformation into a key figure of stability has become one of the more unexpected storylines of the modern royal narrative. What Pope Francis seemed to recognize and quietly affirm was that leadership takes many forms. Camilla's rise wasn't defined by grandeur, but by her ability to be steady, consistent, and present. These are the same values Pope Francis often spoke of when describing the qualities he believed most important in leaders of faith, politics, or public life. He once said that the world doesn't need more loud leaders, but more quiet hearts who listen, serve, and endure. For the British public, watching this shift has prompted reflection on what they expect from the monarchy. In the past, royal leadership was often defined by visibility, grandeur, and formality. But now there is a growing appetite for something more grounded. People are increasingly drawn to authenticity, to a sense that those in power understand the world as it truly is. And this is where figures like Charles and Camilla, in their current season of life, begin to resonate differently. King Charles, once viewed as overly philosophical or out of touch, is now being seen by some as a more contemplative monarch, someone who has wrestled with personal and public expectation for decades and is trying to lead with a sense of perspective. His public appearances, though fewer, often carry emotional weight. Whether he's planting a tree in a small community garden or speaking softly at a remembrance ceremony, he does so with the gravitas of someone who knows that leadership isn't about dominance, it's about presence. Queen Camilla, meanwhile, continues to quietly shape the daily life of the monarchy. Her schedule remains full, but measured. Her approach hasn't changed much. She still avoids drama, still keeps her comments brief, and still shows up for the charities and causes that often don't make front-page news. But what has changed is the way people are starting to notice. Her commitment, her consistency, and her ability to step forward when needed, especially during Charles's illness, have made her a symbol of endurance in a time when many institutions are seen as fragile. This balance between tradition and adaptation has always been the monarchy's most difficult task. In a world that's constantly changing, how do you remain relevant without losing the essence of what you are? In the case of Charles and Camilla, the answer seems to be unfolding quietly, not through grand reforms or dramatic departures from tradition, but through the steady redefinition of roles based on necessity, trust, and a shared understanding of service. For now, King Charles remains on the throne, and there are no public signs that any significant change is imminent. Prince William continues to increase his presence, and the younger generation of royals, including Princess Anne and the Duke and Duchess of Edinburgh, continue to play key roles. But what's clear is that the monarchy is subtly reconfiguring itself, not out of crisis, but out of a calm recognition that time, illness, and public expectation are shaping a new chapter. The meeting with Pope Francis did not produce headlines at the time, but in hindsight, it may be seen as one of those quiet moments where something important shifted, not in the headlines, but in the hearts of those involved. It was not a formal declaration, but a recognition of how leadership, especially in its later stages, often becomes more about wisdom than command, and more about preparing the path ahead than walking it alone. In the months and years ahead, it is likely that the royal family will continue to evolve, perhaps not in dramatic ways, but through a series of subtle changes in tone, responsibility, and public presence. And as they do, the quiet guidance of Pope Francis, offered in the final days of his life, may continue to echo in the decisions they make. Whether it leads to a change in leadership or simply reinforces the roles as they are, the impact of that private conversation remains powerful. It reminded the world, and perhaps reminded Charles and Camilla themselves, that leadership at its best is rooted in compassion, courage, and the quiet resolve to carry on, even when the road ahead is uncertain.